The 93 children who lived in the Victorian Orphanage of London, the cruelest charity of the Church, London, 1871. In the Whitechapel district, on a street where the fog never fully lifts and the cobblestones smell of horse dung and coal smoke, someone sealed the windows of St. Agnes' House of Refuge from the inside with mortar. The neighbours heard for 3 days the desperate cries of 93 children who would never see sunlight again. When they finally broke down the doors, what they found inside made the Church of England suppress every record of the case for the next 40 years. But before I tell you what they discovered in those sealed rooms, I need to ask you something. If you enjoy history that most people never get to hear, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the bell. Leave a like if this opening already has you leaning forward. And drop a comment telling us what city and country you are watching from. We are always amazed by how far this reaches. Now, let me tell you the full story of St. Agnes' House, the place where Christian charity became the cruelest thing these children had ever known. To understand the scale of what happened here, you have to travel back to the middle of the 19th century, to a London that looked nothing like the city you might picture. The British Empire was the most powerful institution on earth. 1/4 of the globe flew the Union Jack. The Industrial Revolution had made Britain the workshop of the world, its factories, its railways, its steamships moving faster and further than anything that had come before. And in the East End of London, children were dying in the streets. Not slowly, not quietly. In Whitechapel, Stepney, Bethnal Green, Spitalfields, neighbourhoods packed so tightly that a single tenement building might house 40 families, child mortality was catastrophic. Historians estimate that in some streets, more than half of all children born would be dead before their 5th birthday. Typhus swept through the buildings like wind. Cholera returned every decade with almost mechanical regularity. Tuberculosis was so common it had its own nickname, consumption, because it simply consumed you slowly from the inside. And behind all of it, orphans, tens of thousands of them. Fathers killed in factory accidents, machinery with no safety guards, no regulations, no one responsible when a man lost his arm or his life. Mothers dead in childbirth, which in an era before antiseptics and modern medicine was appallingly common. Parents carried away by the same epidemics that left their children standing in empty rooms, too young to understand what had just happened. 100,000 pauper children, some estimates said. 100,000 in a city of 3.5 million. The workhouse system, created in 1834, was supposed to manage this. It did not. The workhouses were overcrowded, brutal, and chronically underfunded. Charles Dickens had already written Oliver Twist. The whole country knew what went on inside them. A rising Victorian middle class, increasingly wealthy, increasingly pious, and increasingly uncomfortable with the sight of starving children on their streets, decided that something more charitable was needed. That was when the orphanage movement was born, and that was when men and women of God began building institutions across London, funded by the donations of good Christian families, promising to rescue these children from the gutter and raise them in the light of the Lord. The promise was genuine, in many cases. In others it was something else entirely. St. Agnes' House of Refuge had been established in 1851 in a large Georgian building on a quiet side street in Whitechapel. A building that had once been a warehouse, converted at considerable expense by a consortium of Church of England donors, who considered themselves among the most respectable philanthropists in London. The building could house up to 100 children, distributed across 3 floors. The ground floor held the kitchens, the refectory, and the administrative offices. The 2nd floor housed the younger children's dormitories. The 3rd floor was for older children, those between 10 and 14. In the basement, which the official documentation referred to as rooms of correction, were small chambers where children who had committed infractions were sent. The woman placed in charge of St. Agnes' House was a Sister Margaret Alcott, 53 years old, sent from a diocesan office in the city with instructions to bring discipline, education, and moral formation to the children of the East End poor. She had been appointed in 1868, replacing the institution's founding matron, a Mrs. Caroline Howell, who had retired after 17 years of unremarkable but adequate service. She arrived with 4 assistant sisters, Sister Ruth, Sister Patience, Sister Constance, and Sister Mercy. Each was responsible for a different aspect of the children's care. The children who came to St. Agnes House arrived from across the East End. Some were genuine orphans, both parents dead. Others had surviving mothers who could not feed them. Women working 14-hour days in matchstick factories or taking in laundry, unable to provide. A few had been sent by parish officers who had no other option. All of them arrived hoping for safety, for a bed, for food, for something resembling a future. Among them was a boy named Thomas Hartley, 11 years old, whose father had been killed when a crane collapsed at the West India docks. Thomas had an unusual stillness about him, a watchfulness that the other children noticed. He had learned early that paying attention was how you survived. There was also a girl named Agnes Birch, 7 years old, who had been found sitting beside her mother's body in a Stepney court by a parish officer simply doing his rounds. Agnes had been sitting there for 2 days. She had not cried. She had simply waited, the way a child waits who does not yet know there is no one coming. And there was Samuel Webb, 13 years old, the oldest boy in the house, who had already spent 18 months in a workhouse before being transferred to St. Agnes. Samuel had seen things. He knew how institutions worked. From the moment he arrived, he watched Sister Margaret the way you watch a storm forming on the horizon, not yet certain how bad it will be, but certain it is coming. Life at St. Agnes House followed a schedule so rigid it had the quality of a machine. 5 o'clock in the morning and the bell. Not a gentle sound, a clanging iron bell that ricocheted off the stone walls of the dormitories and brought children lurching upright from their sleep. Morning prayers followed immediately, 1 full hour kneeling on stone floors reciting the liturgy, not sitting, kneeling, on stone. After prayers, breakfast, a watery porridge that the children called grey water among themselves, and beans so hard they sometimes left the pot still crunching. The portions were small, they were always small. The children ate in absolute silence. Speaking during meals was a punishable offence. Mornings were given to work. The older boys were sent to the yard to chop wood, haul coal and maintain the building. The older girls scrubbed floors, washed laundry in cold water until their hands cracked and bled, and polished the refectory tables until they reflected like mirrors. The younger children swept, tidied and ran errands. Education occupied the afternoons. A damp room on the ground floor where the children copied biblical verses onto slates and learned enough arithmetic to count, though never enough to question. The catechism dominated everything. The children memorized long passages. They recited saints' lives. They studied the theology of suffering, why God permitted pain, why endurance of hardship brought the soul closer to heaven, why the body's discomfort was the spirit's purification. Sister Margaret returned to this theme constantly. Pain is instruction, she would say, walking between the rows of children during their evening prayers. The body that suffers learns. The soul that endures is made ready. The neighbourhood initially saw St. Agnes House as a genuine blessing. The children who occasionally came to the market to make purchases appeared clean, well-behaved and orderly. They walked in pairs. They kept their eyes down. They said, "Please" and "Thank you." But there were things that some of the more observant people noticed. Eleanor Marsh, who ran a bread stall on Commercial Street, would later tell investigators that the children from St. Agnes always had their hands hidden inside their sleeves, even in warm weather. When she once offered a piece of warm bread to a girl waiting at the stall, a small act of kindness, the child recoiled as if she expected to be struck for accepting it. She said "thank you" in a voice so flat and careful, it did not sound like a child's voice at all. Arthur Fielding, who owned a hardware shop nearby, noticed that the children from St. Agnes never lingered, never looked in windows, never expressed any curiosity about anything around them. He had seen soldiers with more animation than these children. Reverend Thomas Clark, vicar of the local parish, had attempted on several occasions to visit St. Agnes House to offer pastoral support. Sister Margaret always found reasons to postpone. The children were unwell. There was maintenance work. It was not an appropriate time. She would write to him when circumstances permitted. She never wrote. The first winter of Sister Margaret's second year was when the signs became harder to ignore. The children who came to the market in December of 1870 were visibly thinner than they had been in the summer. Their uniforms, always clean, were now showing repairs upon repairs, patches over patches, seams resewn so many times the fabric had lost its original shape. Agnes Birch, who had once had round cheeks that made her look younger than 7, now had hollows beneath her eyes that made her look much older. Thomas Hartley, watching everything from the third-floor dormitory, had begun to notice a pattern that disturbed him in a way he could not fully name. Certain children, after being taken to the basement rooms of correction, came back changed, not just chastened, the way a child is after a punishment. Changed in a deeper way, quieter, more careful, with a quality in their eyes that he had seen once before, in the eyes of a dog that had been beaten past the point of resistance. He had seen too many friends go down those stairs and come back different. He had heard too many sounds from the basement that he could not explain, but Thomas Hartley was 11 years old, in a building he could not leave, with no one to tell and no language for what he was afraid of. Like every child in St. Agnes House, he had learned that survival depended on silence and compliance. What none of them knew was that Sister Margaret had begun to develop what she called, in her private journals, her methodology of spiritual preparation. She had come to believe, with the absolute certainty of a person whose faith has curdled into something unrecognizable, that the children arriving at St. Agnes House were contaminated by the world they came from. The streets, the poverty, the moral degradation of the East End. She believed it was her sacred obligation to clean them, not their bodies, their souls. And she had concluded that the traditional methods were insufficient. The fasting periods, which had initially lasted 1 day, had extended to 3, sometimes 4. The morning prayers, once 1 hour, now ran until children fell sideways from exhaustion. The basement rooms were used with increasing frequency, and Sister Margaret had begun selecting certain children for what she called special sessions, conducted in a room in the basement that the other sisters were instructed never to enter. What happened in those sessions was known only to Sister Margaret and her victims. But the children who attended them returned with a compliance so total, a stillness so complete, that it frightened even their fellow inmates. If you are still watching, and I believe you are, I want to ask you something. How many stories like this one have simply disappeared? How many institutions operated behind respectable facades while children suffered in silence? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. This is the kind of history that only survives because people keep asking the questions. Everything changed in the early hours of the 14th of November, 1871. That night, a storm was moving across London from the Thames, not the worst storm the city had seen, but a relentless battering rain that kept most people indoors and turned the streets of Whitechapel into running rivers of brown water. Thomas Hartley could not sleep. It was not only the storm. There was something in the building, a tension he felt in his chest without being able to locate it, the way you feel before something happens that you cannot yet identify. The sisters had been strange for days, whispering in corridors, stopping when children approached. Sister Margaret had been moving through the building with a focused intensity that reminded Thomas of something, though it took him time to place it. She moved like someone executing a plan they had been rehearsing for a long time. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, Thomas heard footsteps in the corridor outside the third-floor dormitory. Not the careful, measured steps of a nightly round. These were heavier. Multiple people, moving with purpose, dragging something. He rose from his cot without a sound, a skill he had refined over months, and pressed himself against the wall beside the dormitory door. Through the gap at the bottom, he could see the shadows of figures moving in the corridor, lit by the candles they carried. He counted at least 6 silhouettes, all in the dark habits of the sisters. But there was something wrong in how they moved, too coordinated, too deliberate, like people who have rehearsed this. He eased the door open by a fraction, and what he saw stopped his breathing entirely. The sisters were moving the corridor's heavy furniture, oak wardrobes, bookshelves, storage chests that normally required 2 men to shift, and placing them against the windows. And they were carrying something else, buckets. Heavy, sloshing buckets, from which they were applying a thick grey mixture to the window frames with flat wooden tools. Mortar. They were sealing the windows. Thomas woke Samuel Webb without a word, a touch on the shoulder, a finger to his lips, a gesture toward the door. Samuel looked, understood immediately. The two boys watched for another hour, motionless, as the sisters worked their way methodically along the corridor. Every window, every gap, every seam where air or light could enter. The mortar was applied with a thoroughness that suggested not improvisation, but preparation, mixed in advance, in the right quantities, to exactly the right consistency to harden quickly in the cold night air. At approximately 4 in the morning, Sister Margaret gathered the sisters in the corridor close enough that Thomas could hear every word. "It is done," she said, in a voice that trembled with something that was not quite emotion and not quite calm. "We have separated these children from the corrupted world. Now it falls to God to demonstrate whether their souls are fit for his kingdom." One of the sisters whispered, "And if they do not survive the trial, then they will have found the swiftest path to eternal grace," Sister Margaret replied. "In either case, we will have served them better than the world ever could." The sisters moved toward the single remaining exit, a small rear door on the ground floor leading to a storage yard. Thomas heard them descend, heard the door open, heard it close, and then he heard very clearly the sound of the bolt being drawn across from the outside. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Thomas was the first to move. He went directly to the nearest window and pressed his hand against the seal. The mortar had already begun to harden. Not yet stone, but heading there fast. He woke Samuel. Together, they went to every window on the 3rd floor, all sealed, all curing. They went to the stairwell door. It opened, and the sisters had not locked the internal stairs, but the ground floor exit at the base was bolted from outside, frame cemented. What followed was the hardest thing Thomas Hartley would ever do. He and Samuel went room by room, dormitory by dormitory, waking 91 children and explaining as calmly and as quietly as possible what had happened. The younger children woke in confusion, then disbelief, then a terror that spread through the building the way cold spreads through stone, slowly at first and then everywhere at once. Agnes Birch was one of the first to understand fully. She had already survived more than most children twice her age. She did not cry immediately. She looked at Thomas with an expression that was too old for her face and said very quietly, "Are we going to die here?" Thomas did not answer that question. He began organizing instead. He divided the 93 children into groups. The older ones were sent to search the building for anything that could break through the sealed windows: kitchen knives, iron pokers from the fireplaces, the legs of wooden chairs. The older girls took charge of the smallest children, keeping them calm, keeping them together. Samuel Webb took charge of the food inventory in the kitchen. What he found was almost worse than the windows. The stores held enough food for perhaps 2 days of reduced rations. Dry beans, some hardened bread, a small amount of oatmeal, nothing more. Why is there so little? Samuel asked himself, staring at the shelves, and then he understood. Sister Margaret had not been negligent about the food supply. She had been deliberate. The stores were thin because she had planned them to be thin. She had not wanted the children to be able to survive long. The first day of the siege passed in a grinding alternation of effort and despair. The children attacked the sealed windows with everything they had, and achieved almost nothing. The mortar had cured so completely in the cold night air that the barriers were functionally identical to the walls around them. The tools were inadequate. Small hands, exhausted and frightened, making almost no impression. Agnes Birch lost her voice before the first day was over. She had been calling for help from the upper floor windows, gaps in the mortar too small to see through but through which sound could travel, until her voice was gone. She continued moving her lips long after no sound came out, because she did not know what else to do. In Whitechapel, the storm had left enough damage to occupy every household. Tiles replaced, drainage cleared, shutters repaired. No one had reason to walk down the side street where St. Agnes' house stood at the end, silent, its windows grey and solid. But on the morning of the second day, something changed. William Farrow, a baker on Commercial Street, was delivering bread to a customer near the end of St. Agnes Lane when he stopped walking. He stood very still. He was not a man given to imagination. He had grown up in the East End. He had heard plenty of noise in his life. But what was coming from the upper floors of that building was not noise. It was children's voices, many of them, high and cracked and desperate, saying words he could not quite make out, but whose meaning was unmistakable. He dropped his breadbasket and ran. Within the hour, a group of 20 men had assembled at the gate of St. Agnes House. Local tradesmen, a clergyman, 2 parish officers, and the area's single police constable, a young man named Edward Cole, who had been in the job for less than a year and had never faced anything remotely like this. Reverend Andrew Gale pressed his face against the iron gate and called out. He was answered immediately. From the upper floors, a cascade of children's voices that hit him like something physical. "Help us! Please!" "The sisters locked us in. We have been here 2 days. The little ones are sick. Please!" The gate was locked. The men went over it. What they found confirmed everything. Every window frame, visible from outside, was a solid grey barrier of hardened mortar. Ground floor, first floor, second floor. Every one. The main door did not move, blocked from inside and cemented at the frame. Reverend Gale pressed himself against the door and called through the gap. "I am Reverend Gale. We are here. Can you hear me?" Thomas Hartley's voice came back through the door, controlled with an effort that Gale would say afterward he had never forgotten. "We hear you. There are 93 of us. We have had almost no water today. The children under 7 are not able to stand. Please hurry." The men set to work. Axes, crowbars. A heavy ram improvised from a length of timber. They attacked the door, but the sisters had piled furniture against it from inside, and each piece had to be broken apart before the next layer could be reached. The mortar at the frame was like rock. Every stroke of the axe removed a small fraction of what needed to go. Inside, the children heard the sounds of rescue and pressed toward the door. Agnes Birch could not stand. She sat on the stone floor of the refectory with the smallest children gathered around her, holding their hands, watching the door. After 4 hours, the gap was wide enough for one person. William Farrow, the baker, was the smallest man present. He went through first. What he found inside, what he saw when his eyes adjusted to the dim light of that building, he described only once to a parliamentary inquiry 8 years later, and he requested that his full testimony not be published in the newspapers. What is known from the official summary is this: the 93 children of St. Agnes House were gathered in the refectory on the ground floor, sitting and lying together in clusters, the larger children holding the smaller ones, some of whom were unconscious or barely responsive. Their lips were cracked, their eyes sunken. Several of the youngest were running fevers. All of them were in the final stages of dehydration. Agnes Birch looked at Farrow for a long moment when he came through the gap. Then she reached out and touched his sleeve with one finger, very lightly, as if she was not certain he was real. "You came," she whispered, in a voice like dry paper. "Yes," he said. He could not say anything else. Thomas Hartley came forward to meet him. He was upright. He had not allowed himself to collapse because he had understood since the second night that if he collapsed, some of the smaller children would too. He gave Farrow a precise account of the situation: who needed water most urgently, who had the highest fevers, which door would be easiest to widen. Then, when Farrow told him that more men were coming, that it was over, that they were all going to be brought out, Thomas Hartley sat down on the stone floor, very slowly, and put his face in his hands. He stayed like that for a long time. And now, before I tell you what the investigators found when they went through St. Agnes House, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because what comes next is the part that the Church of England did not want anyone to read. The rescue took the rest of the day. Children were brought out one by one, or carried when they could not walk. The women of Whitechapel had already organized: warm broth, clean water, beds improvised from every spare blanket and coat in a 3-street radius. Local families took children in without being asked. Samuel Webb refused to leave until every child had been accounted for. Agnes Birch was carried out by William Farrow himself. She had stopped being able to walk by the end of the first day. She weighed, he would later testify, about the same as a large bag of flour. When Thomas Hartley finally came through the door, one of the last, the Reverend Gale was waiting on the other side. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You kept them alive," he said. Thomas looked up at him. He was 11 years old. His face looked 40. "Not all of them," he said. Gale frowned. He had counted. All 93 children were out, all of them breathing. "What do you mean?" he asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Some of us lost parts of ourselves in there," he said. "Parts that aren't coming back." The investigation of St. Agnes House began that same evening, while the children were still being cared for in homes across Whitechapel. Reverend Gale and 2 parish officers entered the building with lanterns. The police constable, Edward Cole, came with them. In Sister Margaret's office on the ground floor, they found the first documents. The accounts ledger covered 5 years of operation and recorded donations in extraordinary detail. In 5 years, St. Agnes House had received more than £40,000 in charitable contributions, a figure that in 1871 represented a considerable fortune. Donations in kind were also recorded: food, clothing, coal, furniture, medical supplies. The quantities were significant. The condition in which the children had been found did not correspond to this level of resource, not remotely. A separate file of correspondence revealed the discrepancy. Sister Margaret had been systematically selling donated goods, food parcels, clothing bundles, coal deliveries, to traders in Bermondsey and Hackney, with the proceeds deposited to an account held under a false name. The children had been living on the minimum that could maintain the appearance of adequate care during inspections, which had been scheduled in advance and prepared for accordingly. They searched further. The basement rooms of correction were 3 chambers at the end of a low stone corridor. The first 2 contained objects that caused the parish officer, a man who had worked in the East End for 15 years and believed himself not easily disturbed, to walk back out into the corridor and stand against the wall for several minutes before he could continue. Chains of a size appropriate for children's wrists and ankles, leather straps attached to a wooden structure in the center of the room. Collections of implements whose specific purpose was unclear, but whose general purpose was not. And on the floor of the second room, children's clothing, undergarments most of it, arranged by size, from the very smallest to the adolescent. All of it stained. The third chamber was smaller, almost a cell. Its walls were entirely covered in drawings, not normal children's drawings, figures on crosses, angels with swords driving small human shapes into darkness, scenes of martyrdom, in the style of a child who had been taught a very specific theology of suffering and had processed it the only way available to them, by drawing it over and over until the walls ran out. In the center of this room, on a small wooden table that served as an improvised altar, someone had arranged objects that clearly had belonged to children: locks of hair in different colors and textures, small pieces of fabric, items collected deliberately over time. On the wall behind the altar, scratched into the stone with what appeared to be a nail, was a text. Reverend Gale read it aloud, slowly, because his lantern was dim and the letters were small. His voice did not change as he read. He kept it steady by an effort of will. The innocent must be purified through the discipline of suffering. Only when they have endured sufficiently may they be considered worthy of the kingdom of heaven. Each tear shed washes a sin from their contaminated souls. Each cry of anguish is a prayer ascending directly to the throne of God. I have been chosen as his instrument in this work. The 93 children of St. Agnes House shall be my purest offering. It was signed. Dated the 4th of November, 1871, 10 days before the windows were sealed. The search for Sister Margaret and her assistants began immediately. Witnesses in Aldgate had seen a group of women in religious habits board a night coach heading north on the evening of the 14th. Inquiries to coaching inns along the North Road produced partial descriptions and contradictory accounts. The sisters had not travelled together. They had separated, a detail that suggested the escape had been planned as carefully as the ceiling of the building. Sister Margaret was found 6 weeks later, not in the north, in a boarding house in Southampton, under a false name, in a room that contained 3 filled notebooks of the same nature as the documents found in the basement, detailed accounts of what she described as spiritual sessions, written in a clinical language that made the content somehow more horrifying than blunt description would have been. She showed no agitation when she was arrested. She told the arresting officers that she had expected this, that the work had been interrupted, not concluded, that God would find other instruments to complete what she had begun. At her trial, which took place at the Old Bailey in June of 1872, The prosecution presented the account ledgers, the basement evidence, the text scratched into the stone, and the testimony of 14 children. Thomas Hartley spoke last. He was 12 years old by then. He answered every question directly, without hesitation. He described what he had seen, what he had heard, what he had organized during the 2 days of the siege. When asked by the defense counsel whether he held any animosity towards Sister Margaret, Thomas looked at her for a moment before answering. "I don't think she ever saw us as children," he said. "I think she saw us as a problem she had been given to solve." Sister Margaret Alcott was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to life imprisonment. She died in Millbank Prison in 1879, having never, by any recorded account, expressed remorse. Sister Ruth and Sister Patience were convicted on lesser charges and served 12 years each. Sister Constance was acquitted on grounds of diminished capacity and committed to an asylum. Sister Mercy fled to Ireland and was never found. The investigation that followed the trial revealed something the Church of England's authorities were deeply reluctant to acknowledge. St. Agnes House had not been an isolated case. Correspondence found in Sister Margaret's notebooks referred to a network of letters exchanged with matrons and superintendents at 7 other charitable institutions across London and the home counties. The theology of suffering that had driven her methodology had not originated with her. It had been articulated in writing by a clergyman who signed his letters only as Brother Nathaniel, whose identity was never conclusively established, and who appeared from the correspondence to have been actively advising at least 4 institutional heads simultaneously. When investigators visited the other institutions referenced in the notebooks, 2 had already been quietly closed by their governing bodies. The remaining 4 showed patterns in their accounts, their punishment records, their children's physical condition that prompted immediate inspections and, in 2 cases, criminal referrals. The total number of children who had passed through St. Agnes House since 1851 was, according to the registers, 119. The number found during the rescue was 93. The discrepancy of 26 children was investigated. 14 were traced to legitimate transfers or to families. The remaining 12 were not accounted for. In the autumn of 1872, during a drainage improvement project in the yard behind St. Agnes House, workers found disturbed earth. 8 burials. The coroner's inquest recorded them as the remains of children between 5 and 12 years of age. No cause of death could be established from the state of the remains. No records existed of these children's deaths because no records had ever been meant to exist. The remaining 4 of the 12 unaccounted for were never found. They do not appear in any transfer record, any workhouse register, any parish burial record, or any institution in England or Wales. They simply ceased to exist in the documentary record at the point they entered St. Agnes House. Where they went or what was done with them was never established. The Church of England's inquiry, conducted privately, was sealed in 1873 with an order that it not be opened until 1913. When 1913 arrived, the order was extended to 1953. When the archives were finally examined in the 1950s by a researcher from University College London, he found that the most significant sections of the report were missing, removed at some point in the intervening decades by persons who left no record of having done so. What remains in the public record is the trial transcript, the coroner's report, and the parliamentary inquiry of 1879, which led indirectly to the passage of new inspection regulations for charitable institutions in 1882. Regulations requiring quarterly visits, requiring no advance notice, requiring records that could not be quietly altered. They came too late for the children of St. Agnes House. They may have come in time for others. The building at the end of St. Agnes Lane was demolished in 1876. There is nothing there now to mark what happened. No plaque, no memorial. The street itself was renamed during slum clearances at the turn of the century and no longer appears on maps under its original name. The people of Whitechapel remembered for a generation. Parents told children. Children told their own children, the way communities preserve the things that institutions prefer to forget. Thomas Hartley became a schoolteacher at 19. He taught in Bethnal Green for 41 years. He was known, by every account from every student who passed through his classroom, for one thing above all others: he never, under any circumstances, raised his voice at a child. Not once. In a letter he wrote in 1891, he described what he believed the experience had taught him. "Whatever I do in a classroom," he wrote, "I try to remember that I am not there to shape them into what I think they should be. I am there to help them find out who they already are." Agnes Birch, taken in by Eleanor Marsh, gradually regained the weight she had lost. She did not speak much for the first month. She slept with a candle burning. But she was 7 years old, and children at 7 have a capacity for reattachment that is one of the most extraordinary things in human nature. Within 2 years, she was singing again, not hymns, which she refused for the rest of her life, but folk songs, street songs, the ordinary music of the East End that had nothing to do with God or purification or the discipline of suffering. She married at 22. She had 4 children. She named none of them Margaret. Samuel Webb became a carpenter. He built houses, good ones, well lit, well ventilated, with windows that opened wide and doors that were never difficult to operate from the inside. His firm's reputation in the East End was built in part on that particular quality, which he had specified in every contract since 1880 and never once explained to anyone. The story of the 93 children of St. Agnes House does not appear in most histories of the Victorian era, not in histories of charitable institutions, not in histories of the Church of England. The events retreated into the silence that powerful institutions know how to create around their failures. And that silence is what this channel is here to break. Think about that for a moment. How many other buildings are there, in London, in this country, across this world, where children cried and no one heard them? How many institutions operated behind respectable facades, collecting respectable donations, while behind their walls something else entirely was taking place? That question doesn't have a comfortable answer, but it is the right question to ask. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a like so that more people find it. And subscribe, because next week we go back inside a different building, a different century, a different set of doors that were never meant to be opened. The past has more rooms than we know, and most of them are unlocked if you know where to look.